Well, on this Veterans Day, we want to make sure that we honor those who have served us. Because you see, when we say served our country, what we really mean by that, what we're really saying in that is those who have served us. We want to remember and honor the men and women who have served and sacrificed for us. It's tempting sometimes to turn a day like Veterans Day into a day of flags and patriotism. There are great days for doing that. I think of Independence Day on the 4th of July, or Flag Day on June 14th, for example. But this day really is about honoring people. The flesh and blood underneath the uniform. The persons who signed their names on the line, who took an oath to defend our Constitution, defend our country, and thereby defend us. This is Veterans Day. And many of our veterans, quite frankly, need more than just our admiration and our respect and our thank you and our patriotic displays. There are veterans who need our help. Veterans who deserve our help. We who are the people of God are reminded that what we do in worship, that all of our religious displays, even beautiful displays like this wonderful altar, cannot be somehow separated from our actions as how we act, what we do as God's people. One beloved passage from the prophet Micah, I think, is very helpful for us today. And so I'm going to read from the 6th chapter of the prophet Micah. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings? With calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has told you, O mortal, what is good. What does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Veterans Day, I think, gives us an opportunity to highlight some of the issues that are very important, perhaps most important to our military families, past and present. None might be quite so significant as the persistent holes in medical care and mental health care, as well as the socioeconomic ills that afflict the health and well-being of those who have served. Today, drug overdoses and suicide are two of the biggest threats to the lives of our veterans. We're learning every day about this ever-exploding opioid addiction crisis, an overdose crisis that is affecting veterans far harder, far more broad than the rest of the American populace, in part because, you see, veterans are more likely to be prescribed painkillers to treat injuries that they received in combat. All told, federal data shows that our veterans are twice as likely to die from accidental painkiller overdoses compared to the rest of the civilian population. Twice as likely to die. And according to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, an average of 20 veterans commit suicide every day. In fact, 18% of all American adult suicides this year were committed by veterans, even though veterans make up just 8.5% of the population. You hear that? They make up 8.5% of the population, yet 18% of all suicides are our veterans. Those suicide rates are highest among young veterans between the ages of 18 to 29. The Veterans Administration also points out in its most recent comprehensive the suicide report, that a big part of the problem is that veterans are not getting or do not have access to the health care services to which they are entitled. A blistering General Inspector's report found that more than 300,000 veterans, 300,000 likely died while they were waiting on VA health care, including some who committed suicide as they waited for mental health services for conditions like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD has also led to an unprecedented number of homeless veterans. You see, without the much needed therapy and mental health services to which they're entitled to, many become disabled to the point of no longer being able to provide a roof over their own heads. Did you know that on any given night, 40,000 veterans are homeless? 40,000 homeless veterans on any night of the year. That statistic is from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And this issue is also closely linked to both the mental health care, or the lack thereof, as well as addiction to prescription painkillers. Will knowing that there are nearly 40,000 homeless veterans on the street, as cold as it was last night, as cold as it will be tonight, will that make any difference to you? Will that make any difference the next time you see a disheveled person near an underpass or along one of our city core sidewalks? Will you ask yourself, is that one of those who served with honor and sacrifice for me? How might we plan to honor these? I shared in my newsletter column this past week a little bit about my father. My father was a World War II veteran who served with the Marines in the South Pacific and was in that great battle near the end of World War II, the Battle of Okinawa. Now my dad, he was a big man, he was an extrovert. Some would say the life of the party. He was an entertaining auctioneer. He could be quite forceful in sharing his opinions about anything and everything. Sound like anyone else you know? But whenever anybody brought up the war, he'd grow quiet and sullen. He'd look away or he would look down. He never, ever spoke about his battle experience. Oh, you might get him to talk a little bit about a buddy with whom he served, but that's the extent of what you could get out of him. Never anything about the battle. And so when I grew older, I read the accounts of Okinawa. And particularly the accounts of the gruesome hand-to-hand combat that was endured by forces as they took Sugarloaf Hill in Okinawa. And I came to understand why it was that he could never talk about that. Now today we would say that my dad had PTSD. Many veterans like him did as well. But then, back then, you know, that diagnosis did not exist. And so veterans like my father were left to just handle it any way that they could on their own. And usually that meant simply stuffing it down and not talking about it, pretending that it never happened. And though the label of PTSD does exist today and gives us a handle, a name for the ongoing terror and experiences that battle-tested veterans still experience even today, too often, even so, our soldiers still are left to suffer in shame, and often left to suffer alone. Soldiers like Richard Robinson, who sought treatment for PTSD. Robinson had been a mechanic on a medical evacuation aircraft retrieving bodies during the Gulf War, many of them civilians, and many of those civilian children, 10 years or younger, kids that were blown up by landmines when they were chasing after a ball or a puppy. Robinson said, you know, you'd go out, you'd pick up a maimed body, you'd bring it back, and you'd talk about what a great mission that was, what a successful mission that was. And it stopped making sense. Today, the Veterans Administration and other organizations have begun to look seriously at some new research about something related to PTSD, but it's something that they call moral injury. Moral injury, a condition related to PTSD that helps explain stories like Robinson's. Moral injury occurs when people witness or participate in something that goes against their personal values or their moral code or their religious teachings. We're talking about things like using deadly force, force that causes combatant or even civilian deaths, or seeing a comrade die in battle, or being asked to follow immoral orders, or being unable to help someone who is injured. All of these things can inflict a moral wound on the soul, according to the Moral Injury Project of Syracuse University. Robinson said his own views on war and God began to evolve as a result of his experience in war. He said you start thinking about who is this God that cares and loves us, because I don't see him on our side and I don't see him on their side. And I got confused because I can't understand any religion that tries to justify war and killing. And I'm still trying to make heads or tails of all this stuff. See, that's a moral injury. Many returning veterans don't return to their places of worship for fear of being confronted with teachings that say that their actions on the battlefield might have been sinful, or perhaps even worthy of punishment. To tell the truth, churches just plain can be uninformed and ill-prepared to meet the needs of returning vets. Oh, we do things like sing patriotic hymns, or we put some red, white, and blue decorations out, but beyond that, the question really is, are we willing truly to make room for the pain and the anger that veterans surely feel? Are we willing to be present and listen? I'd like to suggest that to truly honor our veterans requires more of us than saying thank you for your service. You see, the word honor implies that there is some public declaration that is being made proclaiming the value of the one that we wish to honor. For example, if you think about it, commendations are not awarded in the barracks, nor are they given out in the commandant's office. No. They're presented out in the arena in front of the entire company. And the commendation, it's read aloud, and a valuable medal is pinned to the uniform. Why? To proclaim publicly to any who will see it that this soldier has great value to the division of the military service in which he or she serves. What do we do to honor our veterans, to proclaim to the world that they have great value to us? Let me give you another example of honor. Not all of us have served in the military, so here's another example. In the Christian marriage service, a ring made of a very expensive, precious metal is placed on the finger of the betrothed. Why? Well, it's a public proclamation. One pushes that ring onto the finger of their soon-to-be husband or wife, and they proclaim to all around, with all that I am and all that I have, I honor you. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's the vow that is repeated when one places the ring upon the finger. Hear it? Honor. With all that I am and all that I have, I honor you. And here's the proof. A public symbol that all will see. That had a significant cost. So to truly honor our veterans, I think we should be willing to incur some expense. And it ought to be done in a public way that influences others on how they perceive those that we honor. Oh, I know we respect, maybe even admire our vets, but I have to wonder, are we doing right by them? Are we honoring them? And I believe the answer is no, not when there is an epidemic of veteran suicide, veteran drug abuse, veteran drug overdose, and veteran homelessness. Do you think that we as a church, we could act in just ways, to do justice, to act with justice for the needs of our veterans, even when it costs us to do so? Maybe we as a church, maybe we could love kindness and being willing to be present and listen in a non-judgmental way to the veterans who need a safe place and safe persons with whom to share truthfully and honestly. Maybe we as a church, maybe we could walk humbly with our God by walking humbly alongside those who have served us with sacrifices, both physical and emotional. Dr. Rita Brock of the Soul Repair Center at Texas Bright Divinity School says, faith communities are uniquely suited to help veterans heal from moral injury. Religious institutions commit to people for their entire lives, and they're the ones that understand penance and grief, and they know what it means to violate core moral values. So there are ways for handling this in faith communities that are beyond what I would call a therapeutic treatment model, she said. In other words, they can find more help in their faith community than they can from their therapist. And so Brock has advice for churches like us. First of all, she says, don't patronize veterans. My experience, she says, that vets are allergic to paternalistic attitudes. After all, these are people who have survived a lot, and they deserve to be respected for that. You see, Christians, we try to follow the biblical call to care for the least of these, but Brock says veterans are not the least of these. They're not victims. And that's why moral injury is so important. They're already willing to try to take some responsibility for what they did. They're trying to figure that out. That's a healthy thing. Where are the churches in meeting them when they are trying to sort that out, willing to meet them in a non-judgmental and safe way? One of the most important ways to provide spiritual care for veterans is simply to be present, to listen actively and non-judgmentally, according to Dr. Brock. She says veterans need someone to simply sit and listen, to let them tell their story over and over, because the more they talk about it, the less power it has, and the more they can begin to put it into perspective. And she suggests asking questions like, Are there experiences or memories related to your time in the service that are still troubling for you? Or to ask, where was God in all of this for you? Or to ask, where are you going now with this? They did exactly what their country asked them to do, she says. And feeling a kind of safe sanctuary in their spiritual home, that's what needs to happen. So let's think about that. Let's think about how we as a church could truly honor our veterans. Honor them here, honor them in our community, honor them in our nation. I want those who have served to know I am deeply grateful for everything that you did. But I had a veteran friend tell me, it's so odd when people say that. It was simply our job. People don't thank others for getting up and doing their job each day. That's what we did. We just got up and we did our job. That's true. But it's also appropriate for us to be grateful for the job that you did. can we go beyond that thank you? A thank you that really costs very little to express. Can we go beyond that thank you? Be willing to incur some cost to show honor. It's the least we can do in return for what they have done for us.